In recent years, a vast body of literature has emerged on transhumanism, ranging from polemical essays to in-depth academic critiques. Many scholars have seized upon transhumanism as an object of both fascination and critique, attempting to contextualize it within existing intellectual frameworks among the various interpretive approaches. One prominent line of thought suggests that transhumanism echoes certain archaic religious patterns that are well known to theologians, anthropologists, and scholars of religious studies. These religious underpinnings, they argue, shape the way transhumanism connects traditional religious expectations with technical and scientific developments. At first glance, this religious framing may seem contradictory, as many transhumanists assert a strictly rational, secular approach to technology, aiming to steer clear of any association with religious dogma. However, others within the transhumanist movement acknowledge this overlap, with some even openly embracing the idea that transhumanism might, in some aspects, function as a new form of religiosity. The ways in which transhumanism is interpreted as a religious movement vary considerably depending on the geographical and cultural context. In France, the religious interpretation of transhumanism is largely employed as a strategy of denunciation, whereas in the United States and Russia, the relationship between religion and transhumanism takes on different, more nuanced forms. This raises several questions. What accounts for these differences in interpretation? Where do these divergent frameworks and assumptions come from? In this analysis, I aim not to evaluate the legitimacy of the critique of transhumanism as religion, but rather to question the critique itself and explore the socio-cultural assumptions that shape it. What do these interpretations tell us about the broader stakes of transhumanism? Transhumanism in the US, a religious possibility. The question of transhumanism's religious status first gained prominence in the United States, the birthplace of contemporary transhumanism. Although the concept of transhumanism originated in Europe, the movement, as we have learned to know it, with its activist networks, structures, and practices, took shape in the United States, largely through the influence of cryogenic activism and American countercultural movements with a strong technophilic dimension. Key figures such as Max More and Natasha Vitamore, Nick Bostrom, and James Hughes, alongside organizations like the Extropy Institute, helped bring the movement to life in California during the 90s at the height of the early internet boom. Today, American transhumanism is a heterogeneous landscape. While some major players, industrialists, academic researchers, and enthusiasts remain active, the network of transhumanist activists do not seem to rise as much as it was in the first decade of the 21st century. On the other hand, many of the key themes associated with transhumanism, such as human enhancement, immortalism, the convergence of computing and biology, existential risks, space colonization, and so on, all these themes have been absorbed into mainstream discussions. This raises the question, has transhumanism lost its edge, or has it simply succeeded in making its key ideas more broadly and socially acceptable? One of the defining features of American transhumanism is the frequency with which it is considered through a religious lens. It is also one of its main characteristics that this reference to religion was initially a vibrant topic of debate within the movement itself, before becoming, from the 2000s onwards, a prism for interpreting or critically evaluating transhumanism by external observers. This is particularly obvious in the debates that took place on the Extropy Institute's mailing list during the 90s, where discussions about the connections between transhumanism and Christianity were a regular occurrence. Participants debated whether transhumanism could be compatible with Christian teachings, or if it should be seen as a radical departure from traditional religious frameworks. Three major lines of interpretation regarding transhumanism's relationship to religion can be identified within the American context. The first, articulated by figures like William Sims Bainbridge, co-author of the famous NBIC report of 2002, treats transhumanism as a new form of religion, born in the context of human evolution accelerated by technologies, a new religion that offers a grand narrative of human destiny in place of the cosmos. A second interpretation views transhumanism not as a new religion, but as the fulfillment of Christianity's promises. According to this perspective, figures such as Pierre Teilhard de Chardin or Nikolai Fyodorov are seen as forerunners of the transhumanist movement. Transhumanists like Frank Tipler, Hans Moravec, and Ray Kurzweil argue that transhumanism is the realization of Christian eschatological hopes, bringing about the immortality, omniscience, and spiritual transcendence that Christianity has long promised. A third approach emphasizes the religious nature of technology itself. This perspective suggests that transhumanism, by advocating for the radical use of technology to transform the human condition, taps into the traditional religious functions of transformation, transcendence, and unity. Technology, in this view, performs many of the same roles that religions once did. It transforms bodies and minds, allows for the transcendence of human limitations, and fosters a sense of connection between people. By pushing these functions to the limits, transhumanism achieves religious properties of technology in a way that does not necessarily contradict traditional roles played by religion, but may be seen as part of its core function or complementary to it. These religious interpretations of transhumanism are not limited to the movement's internal discourse. Scholars and critics outside the movement have also taken up this framework. For instance, Hava Tyresh-Samuelson has argued that transhumanism belongs to the category of new religious movements, positioning it as a secular and post-theistic ideology that nonetheless retains many religious functions. Other scholars, such as Eric Davis, trace the religious roots of transhumanism in the history of US Christianity, with its Gnostic sensitivity and its technological evangelism. What is particularly noteworthy is that the American interpretation of transhumanism as religion, whether it emanates from its internal adherent or its external observers, does not seek in general to castigate it. This stands in stark contrast to the French context, where transhumanism's religious dimension is framed in much more negative terms. Of course, there are also religious interpretations of transhumanism that are particularly critical in the United States. However, these interpretations are neither as prominent nor as culturally representative in the US as they are in France. Transhumanism in France. In France, the narrative around transhumanism takes on a very different tone. While the term transhumanism can be traced back to the writings of Jean Coutreau, a French polytechnic engineer who used the word in the 30s, the contemporary French transhumanist movement, called nowadays AFT Technoprog, only began to take shape in the 2000s. The French transhumanist branch has consistently distanced itself from any religious affiliations, and its leaders, like its chair, Marc Roux, have made clear that transhumanism, as they see it, is a strictly secular, rationalist, and materialist move. It nevertheless specifies that transhumanism indeed has something to say to religions, and it is not impossible either to consider it from a religious perspective, end of quote. Despite these efforts of AFT Technoprog to introduce transhumanism with its inner diversity and nuances, the reception of transhumanism in France has been marked by a significant degree of distortion. Much like the game of Chinese whispers, where a message becomes increasingly garbled as it is passed from one person to the next, transhumanist ideas have often been rendered grotesque through various media, academic, and political misinformed channels. A second main characteristic of the French reception of transhumanism is that it is often presented as an alien phenomenon, a bizarre and unsettling import from the United States, characterized by an over-reliance on fantasy, techno-prophetic, and utopian dreams, whereas transhumanism has in fact as much French and British roots as American ones. In this highly French critical context, the religious framing of transhumanism is often used to discredit the movement. Transhumanism is frequently dismissed as a false religion, by both Catholic theologians and secular intellectuals. Catholic critics argue that transhumanism elevates technology to the status of an idol, replacing divine grace with human ingenuity. This critique hints on the claim that transhumanism offers false promises of immortality, omniscience, and happiness, promises that only divine intervention, not science or technology, can fulfill. Secular critics, in turn, cite transhumanism's religious structure as proof of its irrationality. They argue that transhumanism strays from the Enlightenment ideals of reason, science, and secular humanism. By embracing a quasi-religious belief in technology's transformative power, transhumanism undermines the evidence-based thinking central to the French intellectual tradition. These critiques rest on the notion that transhumanism blurs the modern lines between science and religion, reason and faith, technology and ritual. By shifting spiritual hopes like immortality and the end of suffering into the realm of technology, transhumanism disrupts the boundaries between the material and the spiritual, the temporal and the metaphysical. This disruption is especially unsettling in France, given its strong tradition of secularism. The separation of church and state, science and religion has been strictly upheld since the Enlightenment. As a result, transhumanism's merging of spiritual aspirations with scientific progress is viewed as a breach of this social contract, a dangerous blurring of boundaries between distinct spheres of human life. In Russia, transhumanism has evolved differently, shaped by the country's distinct political and intellectual history. Though relatively new, like in France, it is rooted in a unique context. While Russian transhumanism shares some similarities with its American counterpart, it differs sharply in its focus on the state's role. Unlike the libertarian ethos of American transhumanism, Russian transhumanists view the state as the key force behind technological progress and human enhancement. The first Russian transhumanist organizations, like Cryo-Rus, founded in 2006, centered on cryonics and life extension. By 2012, activist groups such as the Foundation for Science for Life Extension, led by figures like Daria Kalturina and Mikhail Badin, began advocating for political support. Dmitry Itskov, a Russian entrepreneur, even lobbied to make immortality a national priority. However, Russian transhumanism competes with cosmism, a homegrown tradition from the late 19th century. Championed by thinkers like Nikolai Fyodorov, Russian cosmism sees technology as a path to universal salvation, including resurrection and the divinization of humanity. While some collaboration exists, tensions remain. The nationalist and conservative branch of cosmism, notably the Isbor Club, views transhumanism as a Western distortion of Russian cosmism's ideals, which are grounded in Orthodox Christian theology. Despite their differences, both movements share an anti-death stance directly opposing the Russian Orthodox Church, which views transhumanism and cosmism as threats to the divine order. The Church rejects transhumanist claims to immortality, arguing that they infringe on God's sovereignty, similar to its opposition to abortion and euthanasia. To the Russian Orthodox Church, transhumanism embodies a dangerous form of Western influence. Let's go to my conclusion. Our examination of transhumanism in the US, France, and Russia reveals how cultural and historical contexts profoundly shape views of the movement. In the US, technology and religion coexist more fluidly, allowing transhumanism to be seen as an extension of spiritual traditions. In France, it is viewed as a disruptive force, challenging the boundaries between science and religion. In Russia, transhumanism intersects with the native tradition of cosmism while navigating the state's political and religious dynamics and the Orthodox Church. Ultimately, transhumanism highlights the complex and often fraught relationship between technology, religion, and politics, and offers a valuable lens through which to examine enduring intersections between faith, reason, and the future of humanity. While the theological political question has long been debated, the theological technical question, which has been at the very heart of my presentation, I mean how technology functions as a carrier of religious or spiritual meaning, still awaits attention and studies of equivalent scope. I thank you.